Que de Louise Stephanie. Hi, my name is Stephanie. Today I'll be highlighting just one community within the Aboriginal descent, with keeping in mind this is the same sad history for a lot of Indigenous people here in Canada as well as the United States. The information could be triggering to some, so I've listed some mental health resources that you can access if you're struggling. Share a personal experience with you. I came from a Catholic upbringing whose caretaker went to an all-girls convent from the ages of 6 to 18. She would often tell stories about how mean the nuns were to the children at the convent. She would talk about how they would physically and emotionally abuse the children, including herself. She would talk about how the nuns would physically discipline the children, the strap being one of the most favorable form of discipline. She would speak about how the nuns would publicly humiliate the children, parade them from class to class, the child wearing gum on their nose for simply chewing it. So from that age on, I portrayed nuns to be heartless. One day, as I sat across the table from a residential school survivor, we were sharing stories and I shared the experiences of my grandmother in her time at the convent. Not knowing a thing about residential schools, how could I have shown my privilege any more than I did in that moment? I felt ashamed, and I still do. I never knew about residential schools, but I should have. It was not that person's place to teach me, but they did. Since that day, I've sought out more to learn about the Mi'kmaq and their culture. Always knowing that I can learn more, I can listen more, I can do more. That I can be a role model to the next generation, to have a little less hate than we did yesterday. One could say that the Mi'kmaq's history is like a puzzle, with pieces being passed down through elders and now being found through artifacts and geology. We're starting to put together that puzzle, and slowly but surely we're creating a picture of what life was like for them, who they are, and who they are today. Let's explore a bit more. Mi'kmaq, the land of the Mi'kmaq. Mi'kmaq is made of Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and also areas in the Grand Peninsula and Newfoundland. The Mi'kmaq people have lived here for over 10,000 years. They were seasonal people who moved to coastal areas in warmer seasons and islands in the winter. The Mi'kmaq people were a community that was well developed. They were well immersed in hunting and gathering, by crafting their own tools and knives and fishing weirs. They did not have currency. They worked off a trading system. What was mine is yours. They had their own policy and hierarchy of peoples, with holding elders as top priority. During the 16th century, early Eastern Canadian settlers began their genocide of the Mi'kmaq peoples. Early settlers tried to convert the Indigenous to Christianity by giving them religious instruction, gaining even more control in the 18th century when the Indian Act of 1867 was created, gaining role of education. One very sad piece to the puzzle is residential schools. These schools were implemented to quote-unquote help the Mi'kmaq people, that children would receive an education if they sent their child. Most families are willing to send their child, but that wasn't the case for most. The removal of the Mi'kmaq children was drastic and cruel, and traumatizing them for centuries. In the 1930s, many of the Mi'kmaq children attended Shubenacadie Residential School. Their culture and language was suppressed. A lot of them were stripped of their clothes, cut off all their hair. Sadly, a lot of these children endured physical and sexual abuse while staying at these schools. Abuse disguised as assistance. How could a young mind process this? Residential school poem. I lost my talk, the talk you took away. When I was a little girl at Shubenacadie School, you snatched it away. I speak like you, I think like you, I create like you. The scammer ballad about my world. 2 ways I talk, both ways I say, but your way is more powerful. So gently I offer my hand and ask, let me find my talk so I can teach you about me. A puzzling memory for the Mi'kmaq peoples here in Nova Scotia is the Centralization Act in 1940. Over 22,000 Mi'kmaq people were displaced to only 2 reserves, Eskasoni and Shubenacadie. Was believed to be a social experiment, first of its kind, but thankfully failed, but still impacts lots of Mi'kmaq peoples today. Authorities would make sure that the Mi'kmaq people couldn't return back to their homes by burning them to the ground, demolishing them, for them to go move into a place that had no running water, no electricity, or even a bathroom. Did no one think of the poor children in this situation? Centralization was a tool to, quote-unquote, beat the Indians into submission. A story that needs to be heard about a little girl is Philip's Wedstad's, scolded for wearing a shirt from home, a shirt that she wore for comfort. Instead of feeling safe, that little girl was stripped away from her belongings. No one cared if she cried out, not one adult to help. Phyllis is only in her 50s. Let that sit in your heart to realize this wasn't yesterday. We'll say this was in the past, but every single one of the Mi'kmaq people are a generation of a residential school survivor. So how can we say this was in the past when it happened to their grandparents, parents, aunties, and uncles? The intergeneration trauma is real for a lot of the Mi'kmaq people, and every child and youth has to go through in the Indigenous community. With the findings of the 215 plus children is when the 215 pledge took off, bringing awareness to everyone's hearts and mind, a way for non-Indigenous Canadians to better understand, to enter relations with Indigenous people. That way we can be ready to hear their story and do something, and that way no child who dies at a residential school is forgotten. Another huge step in the right direction is that this is now being taught in schools, as it is a Canadian history. The next generation will know the difference. They'll understand what was wrong and why it was wrong. They will be no longer acceptable not to know. Another way that these children will not be forgotten. What can you do personally to help, you may ask? Well, there is a movement called #DoSomething. It is a way for non-Indigenous peoples, as well as Indigenous peoples, to make sure that no child that has died at a residential school is forgotten, and all the experiences of those that came back home are to be honored. You can find out more at 215pledge.ca. Thank you so much for listening and bearing through my speaking with COVID. I listed below all my information sources as well as my photo sources. And again, if you know someone who is struggling or you are struggling yourself, at the beginning of this presentation, there is mental health places that you can access, or you can give that number to somebody.